says with pulp.
You like it with pulp?
Not this much. I like the one that says some pulp. The fuck was that for?
Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 252. Doing some more Norwegian black metal.
Som klarte seg veldig fint på 70-tallet uten den dritten.
Specifically, we are going to be talking about the band Enthrall, who put out a couple albums in the 90s and also gives us an opportunity to look at some of the lesser-known aspects of the Norwegian metal scene. So there's a book out there entitled Swedish Death Metal by a guy called Daniel Ekeroth that used to play bass in the band Incision, and I would highly recommend this book. It's a very good read. But it's worth keeping in mind that Daniel Ekeroth is a human being, just like anyone else, with his own opinions and biases, his own lens that he's looking at shit through, and that tends to color the commentary within the book, particularly toward its latter half, once classic Swedish death metal kind of falls off. Specifically towards a lot of melodic death metal and black metal that kind of took over for the Swedish death metal stuff. He levies the charge that they didn't really properly come up through the underground, that they didn't put in the work, put out demos, and most of them just got signed immediately because they were the trendy style at the time, and then immediately proceeded to put out full-length albums. And yes, this is true for some low-quality bands from the time period, and you might think it was true for Enthrall if you just looked at their discography as Enthrall, but the musicians behind Enthrall had actually been working within the deep underground for a decent chunk of time before they even started the band Enthrall, with a couple of projects that not only fed into what Enthrall would later become, but also give us a window into some under-recognized aspects of the Norwegian underground metal scene of the early 90s. A few members of this band used to play in a Norwegian death metal band called The Flesh.
Fresh meat.
That were very interesting. In fact, Norwegian death metal in general is one of my favorite death metal sounds, mostly because there isn't really a Norwegian death metal sound at all.
어플로 주문을 하던가?
Let me explain. When you say Swedish death metal, there is a specific Swedish death metal sound, and most of the time you're thinking of Dismember, or Grave, or Entombed. If you say Floridian death metal, you're thinking of stuff that sounds like Monstrosity or Brutality, or maybe even Eulogy if you're true death metal underground elite. Point is, there is definitely a Swedish death metal sound with the chainsaw guitars, the simpler riffs, the emphasis on groove. There's definitely a Floridian death metal sound with the heavy use of double bass and the winding technical tremolo riffs. You know, there's lots of well-known regional scenes that have a specific sound associated with them. But Norwegian death metal, you got shit like Molested. But there's also stuff like Algol. And there's stuff like Dark Throne back when they played death metal. And they all sound pretty different from each other. There's also bands like Fester and Cadaver that were very important, and they sound completely different. I actually covered all this back on episode 113 of this program, but I thought I'd give you a basic primer. Basically, the cool thing about the Norwegian death metal sound is that there is no Norwegian death metal sound. All the bands sound completely different from each other, and The Flesh was no exception. They did a couple of demos back in the 90s, which came to my attention courtesy of Ken's Death Metal Crypt.
Hey everyone, it's your Uncle Ken, and I'm in the Death Metal Crypt.
Which is one of the few YouTube metal channels that I actually think is very interesting. And that's where I found the Flesh demo. So thank you for that. But this band, like most of the old school Norwegian bands, had a very unique sound. And more than that, this particular part of their background would really go on to color how they would write songs once they got around to doing the symphonic black metal stuff they had going on with Enthrall. The immediate thing that sticks out to me upon listening to The Flesh's first demo is how good it sounds for such an obscure release. And the second thing that sticks out is how they are clearly influenced by early Vital Remains. And if you've watched episode 217 of this program, you know why I would find that interesting. because those first two Vital Remains albums are probably some of the most underrated and exceptionally good and unique death metal out there. They're notable for their usage of negative space, much more ambient than normal drumming for brutal death metal, and very long, complex song lengths that have a whole lot of different unfolding sections, as well as a healthy dose of doom metal influence. And The Flesh does all of that, and they do all of that exceptionally well, but with a peculiar Norwegian frozen atmosphere to it.
Stay cool, bird boy.
So it's super cool that they sound a lot like Vital Remains, but they're not a straight up rip off of that band either, because there's also lots of influences from other bands. For instance, this little rhythmic variation oriented part smells of suffocation to me. I was also detecting a piquant bouquet of incantation with those artificial harmonics they used in that earlier doom metal section. Point is, this is some really interesting death metal stuff, and it's kind of a shame that they never did any full-length albums. We just got 8 songs spread over 2 demos, but both the demos are very well produced. But keep in mind all of those elements I was pointing out when it comes time to hit up Enthrall's music proper, because even though you wouldn't think that this sort of brutal death metal stuff has a carryover into very elegant symphonic black metal, they're gonna resurface. Up next, we have another band that members of Enthrall were involved with prior to taking part in Enthrall, that being the band Paradigma, who provide us with another window into an underappreciated aspect of Norwegian metal in general. Because Paradigma kind of fall in between Norwegian Gothic death doom and Norwegian funeral doom. A lot of people don't know this, but apparently the entire funeral doom genre got its name from the Norwegian band Funeral. Paradigma aren't quite as funeral doomy as that band, at least in the modern sense of the genre term, but they do have a fuckload of funeral doom elements in their very early nascent forms. If you've never heard funeral doom before, it's essentially doom metal done with an entirely atmospheric black metal method of composition. It's big on layers of different ambient guitar being done over very orchestral sounding percussion arrangements, with pretty much all of the stoner and even a lot of the groove usually endemic to doom metal being absent. And as you can no doubt tell from what you're hearing right now, there's a whole lot of all of that going on in Paradigma. Puts them firmly in the camp of other Norwegian funeral doom pioneers such as Funeral and Svartsynd, the Norwegian one, not the Swedish one obviously. But even when they abandon funeral doom for more conventional gothic doom metal, with the female vocals and whatnot, there's still a palpable sense of morbidity that's absent in bands like Theater, Tragedy, or Lacuna Coil. They use the same Beauty and the Beast interplay between the singing lady and the growling dude, but the melodies themselves are much more necrotic and almost kind of dark Mirror of Candlemas sounding. So all those funeral doom elements and all those gothic doom metal elements with the extra dose of morbidity will also become very important for Enthrall. Speaking of which, we can finally start talking about Enthrall proper now that we've set up where they came from. So Enthrall were one of a very mighty handful of bands signed to Hot Records, which was actually a record label started by Shaggy Shagrath.
Watch me swing right in.
Of Dimmu Borgir fame, back when he was working at the similarly bemonikered record store Hot Records in Oslo. Now Shagrath's kind of an interesting character because I only really like the first couple Dimmu Borg albums, and after that I can't stand them. But he himself has a surprising amount of black metal credentials. For instance, one time I saw him talk about how influential Fenris's project Isengard was to him in a Beelzebub documentary.
What was that? The naglfar-thing I Vinterskugge? That's a great one, though.
So that obviously raises his stature in my estimation. And he played on the Best Nocturnal Breed album that I talked about back on the Covenant episode. But he also ran this Hot Records thing that not only put out the last good Dimmu Borgir album, Devil's Path, You Know I'm Right, Don't At Me.
It's the truth.
But it also released a whole bunch of other cool black metal gems, like the Soul Malignant Eternal album, the very first Ara Noir release, the only good Old Man Child's releases, You Know I'm Right, Don't At Me.
It's the truth. Truth.
and the debut and sophomore releases for Tullus, one of my favorite bands that I covered a couple weeks ago. So we have a group of musicians with backgrounds in very unique brutal death metal and very early funeral doom metal coming together to make elegant melodic symphonic black metal under the auspices, the watchful eyes of the guy from Dimmu Borgir. What the heck is this shit gonna sound like?
Let's find out.
Well, it's definitely black metal, but you can hear echoes of some of their death metal priors in riff sets like this one, which honestly sounds very similar to maybe an early 90s death riff given a new black metal coat of corpse paint. The sense of rhythmic variation also draws heavily on the kind of stuff they were doing with the long form songs back in the Flesh days. I mean, there's still plenty of proper black metal tremolo riffs sound like something you might hear on a Kvist album or a Satyricon album or whatever. But then we get into this rather technical little drum break leading us into a little bit of that clever motivic variation on that initial death metal riff turned into a bit of a waltz with this black metal beat under it. And that in turn jumps into another new style they're experimenting with, that being a whole lot of like 80s heavy metal and thrash being reinterpreted through the lens of melodic black metal. As you would expect from songs that have so many constituent parts, runtimes on this album tend to be rather long, with most songs being around 10 minutes. With a whole bunch of different guitar parts, like this one right here, which has a really cool descending bar chord thing. I mean, that was pretty neat. Sounds like something you might hear on a Chasm album or something. Here it comes again. But it's not all black metal gloom and doom, particularly during some of the more heavy metal influenced parts like this one. There's sort of a triumphant feeling to a lot of it, which I find to be rather infectious. So that first Enthrall album, Prophecies of the Dying, clearly an excellent bit of black metal. But for my money, the best album, the cream of the crop,
The cream will rise to the top, oh yeah.
you know, the GOAT of their discography is their sophomore record, 1998's The Mirror's Opposite End, because this one keeps up that symphonic black metal played with brutal death metal level of riff complexity thing, but they also start incorporating a lot more of those Norwegian doom metal influences, and the Dimmu Borgir thing even kind of comes back, because after Stian Arstad leaves Dimmu Borgir, he ended up joining Enthrall just for this album. So it's really a summation of all of the different underground currents that led to the formation of Enthrall. But more importantly than that, this album manages to capture a feeling that I haven't really heard outside of the very first Arcturus album. And a lot of that has to do with how this album is produced, with its very thick, dark, soupy sound that also manages to be rather ethereal sounding despite how dark it is. This little waltzy riff here reminds me a lot of something you might hear on the second Dawn album, Slaughter Sun. And in fact, Dawn is a pretty good comparison for a lot of what this album does, in that it has very long songs, but it's not really focused on being an ambient album or a droney album the same way that a Burzum album might be. It's way more riff-based, and that makes it kind of unique. The other things that make it unique are, of course, those exterior influences. When you hit parts like this, which show off very death metal style riffs being repurposed to sound totally black metal. Like if this had different production on it and they maybe hit the percussive parts a bit harder, it honestly could be like a Suffocation style transition. And it's not just the death metal that makes it come back, because there's also a lot of that stuff you might have heard in a Norwegian doom metal band. This very layered, subtle lead guitar. This part's actually a thorough re-exploration of that waltzy riff from much earlier in the song. And it's got all sorts of wacky textural variations. They're bringing in different drum beats. The lead guitar complexity is at, funeral doom levels. And that's part of why these songs are so long, is they really need a lot of time to let all of their different ideas unfold and breathe. But it never gets boring, which is great. I'm not really a big fan of a lot of the mimetic internet parlance that a lot of people in this quarter of the internet use, talking about comfy friends, fucking whatever, gross, I don't like it. And it pains me to say that this album honestly is very comfy. It has a sense of coziness to it. There's a warm heart under a very icy exterior that fits the muted glowing covers of the album art. And this effect is greatly enhanced by their usage of the always classic Norwegian black metal piano, which provides a very effective matrix for their more funeral doom style riffs to really dance around in. There's a decent amount of female clean vocals on this album, and they are very well done, perfectly balanced between sounding very pretty and very eerie, almost kind of unsettling toward the more minor key sections. And the layered keyboards going back and forth between those pianos and the orchestra stings greatly enhance the atmosphere. Now we're back into that waltzy piano bit from earlier, and the vocals are really going to take off right about now. I mean, shit, dude, those highs sounded pretty impressive to me. I don't know about you. Maybe you're some kind of world-famous power metal singer. You're like, that ain't shit. Whatever. And there's plenty of dark black metal tremolo riffs, because it's still a fucking black metal album, bro. I love that guitar tone. It's really strange, but it fits the music so well. It's got that soupiness to it. That's what reminds me a lot of the first Arcturus album. And it gets very Castlevania with the piano stings. Speaking of Castlevania...
Boom! Haunted house!
Those triumphant heavy metal sounding sections from the first album are back with a vengeance as well, and they even give the bassist an opportunity to show off some pretty impressive stuff. Really cool little fleet-fingered bass scale run right there, leading us back into the funeral doom stuff. The slow, heavy riffs, this time supplemented with the clean vocals, and a whole lot of that absolutely essential, inimitable Norwegian black metal piano. All of these disparate elements being given adequate breathing room, courtesy of the magnanimous song lengths. I mean, this album's an hour and 14 minutes long. And with that surprisingly major key melodic resolution, we drift into the floating harmonies of another Funeral Doom kind of ambient-ish section. There's a reason these songs are all so long, because they got so much shit going on in them. But I want you to discover all the different things going on with this album for yourself, because I think it's a highly underrated Norwegian black metal classic, and everybody should listen to it. Everybody should listen to that first Enthrall album too. That one's great. And definitely check out Paradigma, and especially The Flesh. The Flesh really surprised me with how fucking good it was. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching. I'll see you around.
What the fuck?
なんで私が傷つけられたの？
Mamela!
どうして私じゃなきゃいけなかったの？
There's no water in the pool!
遅いよ